Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live episode of Inlay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari, and today I'm very pleased to have Marty up north with us. How are you doing, Marty?
Good, Payman. How are you?
I'm doing great. First off, Marty, thank you so much for coming on. I know you're a busy man and you're very famous, so I appreciate it.
I'm actually not busy. I'm retired, and so people make that mistake. I tweet a lot, which is like a hobby, but no, I'm not busy. I'm actually not busy. Just the way I like to be.
Well, at least you're doing good work.
Yeah, thanks.
Marty, to get started, could you just tell us a little about yourself, please?
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm known online as Marty Up North, an unacceptable fact checker. And that's because that's what I do online. That's what I'm known for. I'm a guy who breaks down stories and into and events and things, right? And I do that from an engineering background. I'm an engineer by training. I worked in the oil patch in Alberta for 35 years, retired sort of during COVID, formally retired this year. And yeah, that's who I am. I'm just a guy who, wakes up every morning, gets on the internet, and it usually doesn't take me very long that I see a story, whether it can be a politician, it can be a news article, it can be an artist, it can be anything. And then usually within a few minutes of reading stories, there's always one that'll stick out to me. That doesn't quite make sense. And then that'll become sort of a topic for the day. I'll talk about something, and yeah, that's what I am. I'm just a guy who likes to break down the narrative and stories online.
All right.
Yeah.
Marty, before going live, you and I were talking about, how we're going to structure this show. And I said, like, my whole thing is to take these, I call them weapons. Like the government they're weaponizing these complicated issues and they're using it against the public to basically confuse us while they steal our money, taxes.
Yes.
So I was blown away by your description of how they use GDP. So could you tell us, like, what is GDP? What it used to be? What has it become?
Sure. So GDP is a great example of something that's been, as you describe it, weaponized. I might not use that term, but GDP is the gross domestic production, and it's a relatively new term. I mean, like, economists have used GDP in the past, but it came into real light in the 1930s in the United States, right? So the Americans had just finished, we're just coming out of the Great Depression, and then their government was thinking of instituting, social welfare, like trying to get out of, providing more services to the citizenry. And the government wanted to know how much they could afford to provide to their citizens. And they needed a way to kind of think of, to measure the size of their economy. And so there were some American economists who came up with this concept of the gross domestic production, which is basically, that's what it is. It's the size of a government's economy or a nation's economy or a province or a state, right? At first it was done by countries, but now it's also done on a province by province basis. And at first it had limited use. Like it was just it's just a way for a country to sort of express its size and the size of its economy, and to gauge whether they were getting, reaching the potential of an economy, right? And so it was a number interesting to economists. That's it. And then over time, it became interesting in Canada. In Canada here, I'd say that prior to the 1990s, the 2000s, you'd never heard the term GDP, not among the population, but it started appearing because the government was borrowing money. Like in Canada, our governments are borrowing a lot of money, right? And when they're borrowing money, people started questioning them, going like, okay, you're borrowing too much money. You're borrowing too much money. What's going on? What's going on? And the governments here needed a justification for this out of control, reckless borrowing. And so that's what they started. Somebody came up with the idea. It's like, well, let's compare the amount we're borrowing to the amount that we value the country at, the GDP. And so you started hearing this debt to GDP ratio, and they were using that as a justification to borrow more money. So it's what it is. It's an obscure metric that has been used to justify by our governments to justify borrowing a lot of money. That's my opinion. I mean, some. I'm sure the government will say otherwise, but as an observer, that's what I'd say they're doing.
You mentioned the 1930s. Like, how did people see? I know you weren't alive back then, but like, how did people see the world before this concept of like one unifying GDP was just every man for themselves?
That's a good question. I mean, listen, I mean, in the 1930s, this concept would have been just a closed door concept. It would have been, Roosevelt or whoever was asking for this idea. I mean, in the 1930s, it was every man for himself, right? Everybody was struggling. I mean, God, I don't know how to answer that question, but it's I'm rambling. Ask the question again, or how to.
It's
How do
really
we?
a rhetorical
Yeah,
question, I
it's a
guess. Like,
yeah.
I have a feeling that what I'm trying to get at is every year they tell us like the GDP is growing, and I'm like, how is it growing? Are we all becoming more efficient, or is it just more babies being born?
Well, okay. Now you're getting into a good question, right? So let's well, that's so. What is GDP, right? The first question you ask is what's the worth of a country or a province, and somebody came up with this fictitious number, the GDP. Originally, when they first conceived of this number, all they could look at really was they could go sort of collect the annual reports of all the companies that existed in let's say Canada. Let's stick to Canada, right? So what was Canada's GDP in 1960? Somebody would have just looked at all the taxes that were filed by companies and things like that, and added it all up and said, look, the companies in Canada produced, $100 billion worth of goods. So then they said, well, that's the value of Canada. That's Canada's gross domestic production before tax. And some economists would have said, okay, what would theoretically be the number? Somebody said, if we're selling $100 million worth of stuff, but we think we should be selling 200 million, we could say, we weren't achieving our potential. That number kept getting refined all the time because because the economy's changed. So in the 1960s, we made oil, we made cars, we made things like that. So trying to come up with a value for the GDP was fairly straightforward. But then over time, we've added industries that are much more difficult to value, right? So the financial industry or the insurance industry, government, academia, things like that. So there was a race to try and make each country worth more, and so they changed the formula for GDP. I mean, just like to the viewers, you've often heard Canada talking about the G7 countries. Well, G7 is basically means the top 7 countries by GDP. That's what the G7 was. Then there's the G15 and the G20s. So if you wanted to be in the big boys club, you had to somehow or other justify a big value, a big number. And so GDP got changed over time. And these days GDP, like it's such a complicated, weird number that's why they like it, because it's so easy to change. It's, there's components in there, like the value of intellectual property, the value of government, the value of things like that are put in there. And that's the current GDP, where they really play fun and games with it, is trying to forecast where the GDP is going. Because yes, it's not a fixed number, as in theory, as companies produce more, then our production, our gross domestic production goes up. So it's not a fixed number. Actually, that'd be an interesting number. I mean, I guess we could estimate what the total number of everything we will produce in the history of the country. What's that number, and how far are we on track to producing that? I'm digressing. Sorry. Yeah.
No. Let's you're going to realize that I'm operating at like a 6th grade level. So let's imagine we're going back to 1867. The GDP would be like how many head of cattle in the country, kind of thing.
Bingo. Because how many head of cattle, how much wheat we're producing, how many trees we're cutting, how many boats we're building, something like that. Pretty simple.
All right. And what do we have now? Like what is in the GDP now that you're like, this should not be in there, or this is misleading?
Well, government. I mean, They're treating there's a giant there's a component called public administration, which is government. I mean, the GDP numbers were revised not too long ago, and that was one of the numbers that they bumped up. They bumped up the value added to the economy by our government. And to me, I think the government is actually a drain on the economy. The government produces nothing of value, but government is in there. Intellectual property. I mean, most things have some value, but the problem is that some of these values are very, very nebulous, hard to quantify, right? I'd prefer that it was all cows and boats and tons of grain, but we're putting things like insurance, intellectual property, academia. We're giving a value to our schools. We're giving a value to our government. We're giving a value to all sorts of weird things like that.
What do you say to the argument? And by the way, if you can hear, it's pandemonium over here. I don't know what they're doing downstairs, but what do you say to the argument that government is not actually useless? Like they are providing a service, like doctors technically provide a service. Like, what do you say to that argument?
It's valid, but most services that the government claims that they produce or provide can be provided by the private sector more efficiently, more cost effectively. So, that's an example. Sure, there's government doctors, but they don't have to be in government. You could just as easily have private sector doctors. In fact, we do, right? So, I mean, to me, a government is not a producer of services. Never will be. It has become in some countries. There are crown corporations that are owned by the government that produce a service, but I'm an advocate of a much smaller government. Is what I am.
No, I agree with that. What about government giving itself a raise? I remember they did this with cops and with doctors. They're just like, yeah, we're going to give you a 20% raise. That's a 20% boost in the GDP, right?
Yeah, it's actually, before we get to that, let's go back to part of the earlier discussion, right? So how is GDP being used and to justify things, right? So let's go back to the debt. Let's talk a little bit about the debt, right? So that's where you hear it all the time. So the most common term you'll hear now when we're referencing to GDP is our debt to GDP ratio. And so right now, Canada's debt is sitting at, $1.2 trillion, and our GDP is sitting at whatever, $4 trillion. So then they'll say, great, our debt to GDP ratio is 40%. And I was like, okay, first of all, who came up with 40 as a good debt to GDP ratio? It's like you and I, and to compare that, you and I have the same measure. If you have a credit card with $20,000 worth of debt on your credit card, but your income coming in is, I don't know, $80,000 a year, you could you could tell yourself, okay, carrying $20,000 of debt is okay. You're doing a ratio in your head. It's never okay if you're not planning to pay it back. But let's stick to the basics, right? So you say that 20% is a good debt. I might say, well, no, it should be at 10. So that's the first problem, right? So our government has this concept. They say our debt to GDP ratio is at a manageable number because it's under 50%. And they'll give examples of countries like Japan, right? Japan's debt to GDP ratio apparently is like 200. So, they got 4 times the debt. I mean, that's a bad number. So the government, so that's step one. The government justifies the debt that we have by using this weird ratio. But then the debt keeps climbing, right? So if you look at the government of Canada's budget, this year's debt is we're accumulating debt because we're not running balanced budgets. And in the next 5 years, there's no forecast for a balanced budget whatsoever, which by definition means that debt's going to go up. There's no debt repayment line anywhere in the budget for the next 5 years. So they're not interested in paying down the debt. They're borrowing more money. So that's going up. And people keep raising alarm bells going, well, your debt to GDP, you've already said that 40 was good, but we're forecasting you to go up to 50 or 60. So what do you do when you have something like that happen? You adjust the denominator. So the government now going forward in its forecasts keeps increasing the future GDP. And like you said, it's like, okay, if you could show me that we're going to increase the wheat production, the number of cows we own, the number of barrels of oil we sell, I'd agree. That's okay. But when you dig down into the report of how they're increasing that GDP, it's by bringing in more people and by making those people more productive. Like they're literally, and actually everything I'm talking about, I should mention one thing. A super amazing, really good source of information for all of this is the Parliamentary Budget Office. So, the Parliamentary Budget Office is a department within the federal government. It's an independently appointed person, and that person, through his whole department, is there to provide that service to Parliament and to lawmakers. It's that person. It's the Parliamentary Budget Officer's job to forecast the economy and gauge whether what their government's doing is going to be okay and in line. So, and part of the things he does is he forecasts the GDP, he forecasts inflation and things like that. And it's really funny when you like his reports, he never gives historical data. It's really weird. Like he'll provide you last year's data. So he'll say, here's last year's GDP. Then he'll give you a forward forecast of like the next 5 years. And what I do is I always go back to old reports and I keep looking, if he forecasted 40 last year, 39 the year before, 38, 37. Well, I can draw a trend. And when you draw that trend and he goes forward and he forecasts that next year's GDP is going to be 50, you go, well, you're full of shit. Like your own data doesn't validate that. So that's that. And that's the fun that, I mean, some of those reports, they literally read like fiction. Like, I just mentioned productivity. The Parliamentary Budget Officer is forecasting that the productivity of Canadians is going to increase dramatically. Like so much so to justify to come up with this high GDP in the future. And when you compare our productivity has been going down. There's actually nothing on the horizon that would make our productivity go up. So, it's an example. I get nervous when I talk about all these things and I break it down online because the finances of the country are a mess.
Give me 1 second. It's pandemonium here. It's just 1 second.
I can sympathize. I've had some pandemonium days here.
Let's see if that works. Yeah, so I want to go back to something you said way at the beginning. You said if for you and I, if we're getting $20,000 and we have $80,000 coming in, and then you said if we're not intending to pay it off, it would be like if we had $20,000 debt, we took $1,000 from that $80,000, we paid off the $20,000, we got a $19,000 loan, and then the remaining $59,000 we give it to like our wife to spend. Like we're borrowing money to pay off the interest on previous debt, right?
Oh, a lot of money. I mean, Canada's debt is 1.2. The federal government's debt, never mind the provinces and the municipalities and individual Canadians. The federal government's debt is $1.2 trillion. And just the interest payments on that debt are $40 billion a year and climbing. Like they're forecast to be 50 and 60 billion next year. So we're paying more on interest than we do on something like healthcare. So we're paying a huge amount of money just on interest. And there's, like I said, there's no plan to pay it back, those loans. There's no plan to even run a balanced budget. So that debt is a crazy number that we are going to be somebody's going to have to deal with it at some point in the future, because this whole notion that our debt is healthy because of this debt to GDP ratio is nonsense. It's complete nonsense. Like it's complete nonsense. It's and then in your example and in my example, if I go to borrow at some point, your credit card company will say, I'm not giving you any more credit card. Some people do a crazy thing and go get a second credit card to pay the first one off. Our government's actually doing that. When you look in the finances of the federal government this year, there are loans that come due and have to be paid no matter what, and we can't even pay them. So we're borrowing money to pay some of those loans that are coming due. I love going through financial statements of companies and governments and political parties. And I love busting down. Like, I'll give you an example. It's closer to home, right? Like right here in Alberta, Danielle Smith keeps bragging that she's paying down the debt. I'm like, yeah, she's telling half truths, right? Sure, you paid off the minimum on the credit card, so technically you're paying down debt. But you paid off $100 on your credit card, but you're reborrowed 120. Are you paying down debt? Like, you paid some debt, but you're not paying down the debt because your debt is accumulating. So there's very few jurisdictions in Canada. Well, there's none that I've seen that are actually paying down their debt.
I want to explore this a little further. We can come back to GDP, but me and a couple of my buddies, we got together and we sort of, we're not accountants, but we figured out that 80% of the federal debt is because of accrued interest. So 20% went into actual like goods and services. The other is what you said, like you're getting a loan to pay off a previous loan.
Yeah.
Like, is it even possible to pay off the debt? Like, let's say we got rid of all of these, paying people to not poop on the beach, scale back hospitals, education. Can we pay it off?
Well, let's put it into context. So the debt right now is $1.2 trillion. So let's say $1,200 billion. And the government annually takes in terms of various revenue streams, about $560 billion and spends 600. So if the government's in order to pay down our debt, even if we took what's 1,200, like at 600, we could redirect the entire 2 years worth of the entire revenues of the government would pay down the debt, but the debt's accumulating. So I'd have to do the math. You'd have to pick a number. What's a reasonable number? Let's say the government manages to put aside $20 billion a year just to pay down the debt. At $20 billion a year, the 1,200 that's already been accumulated, that's 60 years. At $20 billion a year, that's 60 years to pay down what we've accumulated. The amount of debt we've accumulated is staggering. Actually, I've made a joke about this. When you get your credit card statement and let's say you owe, I don't know, $800 on your credit card, there's that little line at the bottom that says what the minimum payment is. Like, might be $27.83 on an $800 credit card bill. Like that's a 35-year payout schedule. It's crazy, right? And our federal government, the equivalent payout schedule would be $20 billion a year. Actually, and I'm going to do the math. I'll probably do the math at some point and try and figure out what it would be. But it's at this point, listen, the $1.2 trillion, like, it's such a big number. When Trudeau came into power in 2015, the debt was $600 billion. And so it had taken, what's 2015 from Confederation, whatever, like 152 or 142 years to accumulate $600 billion. Trudeau doubled it in 9 years. Like, we're not talking, Trudeau added $300 billion in 1 year alone. In 2020, because of COVID, he added we overspent the budget by $330 billion. Like, the numbers.
I was talking about this yesterday with my father. Like, what is it about human nature that's willing to accept this? Like, is it that they're giving appearance of giving back free services?
Well, no, that's a good question. I mean, I'm making fun of the odd Canadian with a credit card debt. Most Canadians don't even understand what's happening at the federal level because their own finances are such a mess, right? The average Canadian lives well beyond their means, like way beyond their means. I mean, two visits to Mexico every year, nice big car, lease payments, everything else. I mean, most Canadians have like 2 times their salary in debt. So the idea that the federal government's in debt, that's such a foreign concept to most Canadians that it doesn't clue in. And I'll tell you this, I mean, I've done this analysis and I get challenged on this all the time. There's only about 20% of Canadians who pay taxes. Like, no matter how I've analyzed the entire collection of, you can go to Stats Canada and download a summary of all the T1 generals. The T1 general is your tax form that you file at the end of the year. And when you analyze all the T1 generals, you quickly realize there's 40 million Canadians, or 40% of Canadians don't even pay a penny in taxes, just by definition. I mean, they're under 18, they're over 75, and they don't want to work. So that there's 40% of those Canadians are gone. Then of the remaining 60, the bottom, 30% pay like next to nothing. We're talking, less than 5% in taxes in a year. Like everybody whines about paying taxes, but the reality is most Canadians don't even pay taxes. The burden of paying for everything that we have in this country falls on the more affluent Canadians, which, by the way, in this country, like 250,000, you are an extremely affluent Canadian and you're going to get taxed to death. And then it falls on industry and the rest is borrowed. And so we're spoiling ourselves. I mean, if you look at Canada's debt to GDP or just its debt per capita, I prefer the debt per capita, right? That's a reasonable number. I mean, I know with certainty that the federal debt's $1.2 trillion, and I know with fairly good certainty that it's 40 million Canadians. You do one divided by the other, and you go, well, we each owe $30,000. So, and when you look at just that simple metric and you compare us to the rest of the world, we're some of the most indebted people on the planet. In the richest country in the world, resource-wise, Russia, Canada, China, and the US are huge land masses with enormous resources. And rather than properly produce our resources and have real productive lives, we are shooting ourselves in the foot, killing our industries like coal, oil, fisheries. We don't even have a shipbuilding industry in this country, and we have 3 oceans. And so, how are we making money? Where does this GDP come from? It's fictitious at best, and then we live this life of we're just borrowing and paying ourselves, and not worried about it. It'll be future generations that'll take care of it. Like it's crazy. It's now I won't be here to see what happens, and I'm curious. I mean, we all thought that Ireland would go bankrupt and Greece would go bankrupt, and somehow or other they got bailed out. I don't know. Like maybe I'm all wrong about this, but fundamentally we're borrowing. We're living on borrowed money. And this is the key part. Maybe this is a part that when you start explaining it, it all makes sense. Who are we borrowing from? We're borrowing from ourselves. Right? We're borrowing from the Bank of Canada. So most of the debt that we have comes from the Bank of Canada. And the Bank of Canada, people are right. The Bank of Canada will say they don't do this. They absolutely print money. They absolutely print money. So it's bullshit. They print money. We live in a country where our currency is not backed by gold. We have no gold reserves. So our currency is just paper. And how does our currency appreciate? It depends on it. It's absolutely the Bank of Canada absolutely wants inflation, because you lend money at one rate and then you get it paid back at a higher rate, which is an artificial concept. But our bank needs inflation to make money. That's what makes things go round and round. So are they upset that there's a high inflation right now? Absolutely not. But now we're into problems because the Bank of Canada is supposed to act at arm's length from the federal government, but while acting at arm's length, they also have to act as sort of partners and dance with each other, right? So the Bank of Canada says, sure, to Trudeau, I'll lend you money, but at some point you have to stop spending because all this money that I'm lending has to be paid back, and it has to be paid back in a lower interest environment so I can make money on it. And Trudeau's not playing with Tiff Macklin. And in fact, Tiff Macklin is doing the worst thing he can do right now. He's lowering interest rates, which is just hurting. I mean, I have my list of things that I'm looking forward to look at all the time. And right there is, I don't know if you can say it, but it says Bank of Canada. I can't wait. The Bank of Canada's quarterly report's about to come out. The Bank of Canada lost $5 billion last year. $5 billion. First time in its 87-year history, the Bank of Canada lost $5 billion. But the $5 billion it lost, that's nothing compared to the loss that's on its book that it's dragging its feet. I mean, there's I think it lost $200 billion in investment value, which for the Bank of Canada is bonds. It's issuing bonds it issued bonds at a interest rate, and now it's having to buy them back at a lower interest rate, and it's losing its shirt. It's crazy. It's crazy. And then now you got me going on a rant, but and all this data, the government drags its feet on producing this data. Like we're overdue by a month. The data should have been out. Yeah, it's not pretty, folks. Not pretty.
Trudeau's got enough on his plate. He probably doesn't want to release that data. Marty, I just want to be, I guess, in all honesty, we said that 20% of the bottom 20% doesn't pay taxes. Inflation, true or false, it does impact the poor more than the rich. Is that true?
I would say so, absolutely. Yeah, because um you know, let's say let's pick three items, right? Let's pick a pound of butter, something a little more expensive like a color television, and something really expensive like a car. Well, 4% is, if they all go up by 5%, the pound of butter goes up by 50 cents. But for the poor person, as a percentage of what they have, it's a bigger number than for me, an extra 50 cents on a pound of butter, it's still 4%, but I can absorb it. Whereas because if I ask for a 4% raise, I'm going to get a lot of money compared to the poor person. Inflation is absolutely devastating on the poor, absolutely devastating. And well, yes, that's the answer to your question. Yeah.
So the other thing I will come back to the Bank of Canada, but I was playing this out in my head. So Canadians they're addicted to debt.
Yes.
The government says
they're not addicted to debt. They're addicted to the fun things that come from debt. But I guess they're addicted to debt. You're right. Let's go over that.
No, I'm happy to reword it. They're not living within their means.
Perfect.
And they're going into debt. And the government's saying, no, continue, living outside of your means. We'll pick up the slack because we have the power of the printing press, and we'll print everything out of oblivion. We'll get like whatever 20% of the population to pay the taxes. Just keep voting for us. Is that what's happening here?
Yeah. I mean, if you sit in front of, let's say you, me, and a couple of other friends get a big giant whiteboard and we start to draw it all out and see what's happening, it starts to make sense, right? Yeah, let's get people to borrow more money, which drives up inflation, which inflation is an artificial tax. It's a tax for the government because if everything goes up higher, they get a little bit more tax on the other end. Some inflation for the government right now, like we talk about the housing crisis. The government is absolutely drooling at the idea that houses are worth more because the houses are in the hands of people who've had them for 30 years now, the baby boomers, and the baby boomers are going to have to sell them all. So they're drooling. Look at what they just did. They increased the capital gains portion from 50% to 67%, which is a huge tax increase. And people said, who's that going to affect? Well, it's going to, like, people say, well, it doesn't affect your primary residence. It'll affect your secondary residence. It'll affect your business. I mean, it's all, when you draw it all on a map, you start to realize, wow, like there's no incentive to lower inflation really. And in fact, the other thing they're doing, that the government's doing, you can get lost in when you start thinking about this. Some of the things are counterintuitive and counterproductive, like letting in an estimated natural gas. I'm just reading that. I worked on Anticosti. Whoever's making that comment must have known that I worked there. What were we saying? Yeah, the government knows that some of the things it's doing are creating problems, like the out of control immigration, right? Out of control immigration is supposed to help with unemployment and help industry get boosted. Well, no, what does out of control immigration do at this point is jacking up the price of goods, which is creating inflation, which is good for the government, and they'll deal with the out of control immigration in the future. They're creating a long-term problem with a short-term solution, but they don't care. I'm rambling. Let's bring it back to something. I mean, yeah.
No. Tell me how you're talking about how government wants inflation. Yep. How is the price of a house going up? How does that help the government? Is that because the property taxes go up, so it collects more?
Property taxes, the value when the house is sold. Those are the two big ways. I mean, what else? Yeah, well, that's mostly what it is. It's the short term. how a lot of houses are going to get sold in the near future, and they want to capitalize on that. I mean, I think our government is in so much debt that and they're running out of ways to tax us. Like, that's the other problem, right? They're running out of ways to tax us. It's a principle in economics. It's called the Laffer curve, right? You can only tax a citizen up to 50%. Beyond 50, then the underground economy kicks in. So so the people that do contribute are being taxed to death. The government won't tax everybody equally, because then everybody'd wake up. So they need some people who don't pay a lot of taxes, who are perfectly happy taking from the government, and those are the people who keep voting the government back into power. So they need those people. And then the rest of us that are making the economy run and paying the taxes, they keep abusing us, and they can abuse us at will. They don't care. But they know they don't go too far, because if beyond 50%, they know that beyond 50%, we leave the country, we go somewhere else, or we start an underground economy. So and they've done that. So for the 10% of the population that's really paying taxes, they got us at 50%. We're trapped in there, and they can't get another penny out of us. So now, and they're running out of opportunities to borrow. So what do? Inflation solves a problem, and they're eyeing, I guarantee you, they're eyeing principal residences, secondary residences, businesses, RRSPs. I mean, they convinced an entire generation of Canadians to put money in an RRSP, which is a deferred tax. So now it's time for people to pull out that money. I wouldn't be, the government's eyeing all those things, because the government is just, it's savage. It just has this humongous appetite, and there's, it's out of control, which is why I'm watching what's happening in the US and Donald Trump appointing Elon Musk to be his what's the title?
Department of Government Efficiency. Doge.
Yes, I mean, that's Donald Trump understanding that it's out of control and it has to be fixed. And but most people don't even see a problem. Like, most of the people that are listening to you probably don't even, they see a problem, but we're a minority. Because truly, the average Canadian can't fathom this, and it goes right over their head. The idea that the government's borrowing extra money, it's no big deal. Send me my GST check.
I wanted to modify the analogy I gave earlier. People aren't living beyond they're living beyond their means. The government's like, don't worry, I'll print money. You keep going on vacation. And then I think they've destroyed all revenue streams. So now they're looking at the asset class, people who have property, as you mentioned. People have jobs too, but like they're going after real estate owners hard, and it feeds into this narrative that we have high property values because of these boomers, and they're increasing taxes. So in BC, for example, Horgan put a moratorium on rent increases at like 1.5%, but the property value is increasing like 4%, which is property taxes increasing 4%. So if you just do the math, at some point people have to sell.
Yeah. You have to sell, because you can't even gift or transfer, like it. And it's not just, I mean, it's property, but it's farms and it's other things, and businesses. I mean, businesses are, it's sad that you have to sell. You have to sell it in advance. You cannot gift your house. You cannot gift your business or your farm. You have to sell it. And in the process of selling it, there's a huge tax bill. Hey, and speaking of, like, look at the last budget, right? The last budget was called Fairness for All Canadians, which, as soon as I hear that, I go, wow. So what were the budgets before this? Right? So this one, you're making an effort to say this is fairness for all Canadians. What were they before that? Unfair? By definition, they must have been. And then in this budget, the government pivoted and really is trying to appeal to the millennials and the Gen Zs. And I was surprised. The government's finally realized that, okay, we're done with the boomers. They're all going to be dead in the next 10 years, and we don't need them as a voting base. And so in the federal government in particular is throwing the boomers under the bus, the poor boomers. And I'm being sarcastic. If you're a poor boomer in this country, you did something wrong. You're going to get flack for that, and so will I, but that's my stance.
That's fine. I already get plenty of flack.
Yeah.
I had a question, and I I completely forgot about it. I
You
think
were
I'm getting
talking.
Alzheimer's. I'm a boomer as well.
You're not a
Uh,
boomer.
I'm 41. I'm like in no man's land. I'm not really a millennial.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, like I was talking, I talked to my father. He's sort of like my barometer for what's going on in the, the other people, not us.
Yeah.
And he's getting really fed up. Like he has to sell property to be able to pay the property tax. And I'm trying to tell him like it's a type of theft. And he's like, okay, but why would they do that? And it's very hard to explain that narrative because it's hard for people to believe that government can be that evil.
Well, I mean, and for the, we talked about two things that the government's eyeing when it comes to boomers. They know there's an enormous wealth transfer happening. I mean, the boomers have a lot of money locked up in real estate and businesses and farms, so that's going to be transferred. They have an awful lot of money in their RRSPs, and I think, the idea was that the RSP was deferred money, but they're realizing that some people are actually pretty good at deferring the taxes from the RSP, so they're going to try and do things with the RSPs, like force you to withdraw it at an earlier age and things like that. So that's one thing. And I think the third thing that the government's eyeing is an estate tax, right? And people say there are estate taxes. Yeah, there's a probate tax in Canada. At the end of when somebody passes away, you have to declare the value of their estate, and there's a small tax on it. But I think governments are literally eyeing a true blue estate tax. Like, oh, you died with $1 million, we're taking half of it. Yeah, it's an insatiable appetite that our governments have, and why? Like well, I know what I was going to say. We're living beyond our means, and we're unproductive, and we've actually become lazy, and we've become dependent on government. It's crazy how, like, when you dig into stats, like I did this for Alberta this week. I dug into the unemployment numbers, and the unemployment numbers seem a bit high. But then at the same time, you look at the participation rate, and it's crazy how low the participation rate is, and we're letting in people. So when you start to analyze it, you realize people are literally taking themselves out of the working market. They're just not working. They're either part of the underground economy, or they're getting so much money from the government in one way, shape, or another that they're not working. Like, I'm like, wow, that's insane. And so, yeah, I like, we're becoming an unproductive, lazy society, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We used to be good at a bunch of things. Think of what we used to be good at, and now we're criticizing ourselves for the things we used to be good at. Like, it's unacceptable to produce oil. It's unacceptable to farm. It's unacceptable to mine for minerals. I'm like, well, if we don't do any of those things, what's left? Like, we're going to do the same, and we did those things well. We logged. It's unacceptable to cut a tree. Like, holy smokes, man. Like, we're, and we're trying to convince ourselves that we should do the same thing as everybody else. Well, if we all do the same thing, like if we all build solar panels, well, that's no fun, because what am I going to trade with, right? Somebody has to grow apples and farm chickens and cut trees. And so we're and fish, like you guys like, fishing in your neck of the woods is like frowned upon now. I was like, wow, when did that happen? It's like, yeah.
Well, people are losing their minds. I was thinking about transfer tax. You're familiar with this? When you buy a house, you have to pay transfer tax. It's quite substantial. It's like a couple $100,000, and they're using taxes to punish you for making decisions in your life. So if you move into a community and you're like, "Holy crap, I made a mistake. The people in this neighborhood are psychos," you can't move out. Like you can only do that a couple of times. Eventually, you'll lose all the value.
Well, yeah, those are, I mean, the transfer taxes. The other one that's bad is, well, like, just never mind the transfer tax. I mean, we're taxing capital gains, right? And capital gains, like, I've talked about this, right? You make 50,000, I make 50,000. Okay, so we both made 50,000. And after you've spent most of your expenses, you got, let's say, $5,000 left over, and I have 5,000. You take your $5,000, you go to Mexico with it. You had fun. I take my $5,000 that I'm left over. We have the same job, same everything, but instead of, I have one little $5,000 left over, what do? I invest it. I give it to my neighbor who's starting a business. I give it to a kid who's mowing lawns, whatever. I take a risk with that $5,000. I invest it. And then that $5,000 grows to $10,000 because I took a risk. And when I sell my investment and I've made 5,000, my $5,000 is taxed. And for a lot of people, they just go, forget it. I'm not going to invest. It's not worth it because I made $2,500 plus I took a risk. I could have lost the 5,000. I'm just going to go on a vacation. So we punish, taxes are by definition, they form a punishment, but we're taxing everything, which we're punishing everything. Yes, we're punishing you for buying a house. We're punishing you for investing. We're punishing you for driving the wrong kind of car. I mean, yeah, like tax. And those are taxes. They're real. Like your transfer taxes in BC are ridiculous. That $100,000, I agree. That's it. And we just increased in Alberta, we just increased our transfer taxes. And that was our justification. Danielle Smith says, well, they're still not as high as BC's. I'm like, oh my God, the race to the bottom. Like, yeah, why? And transfer taxes, what's the purpose of a transfer tax?
To transfer money to the government.
That's it. Yeah. Like, we needed to register the titles so that somebody else knows that there's a title on the property. I'm like, well, that's got to cost what, $3 and a computer click? Like, yeah, gasoline taxes. And I love people who think that there's these separate special accounts, right? That the transfer taxes are used for this, or gasoline taxes are used to improve the roads, and EI insurance premiums are used to cover something. No, folks, it all goes into general revenues. There's not separate streams and separate programs based on separate taxes. It's all general revenue.
I wanted to bring up another thing, like they're using taxes. Like the purpose of tax is to pay for services like the lights, the roads, but they're using taxes for social engineering. So when they say there's an empty homes tax, a vacancy tax, you can't put your daughter or your son in your spare home because that's technically vacant. They have to sign a tenancy agreement with you. There might be certain areas that have that exemption, but that's the direction we're moving in, where government is regulating our behavior through taxes.
Oh yeah, well, the carbon tax is an example. It's a tax. Hey, that was a funny one. Did you see this week that Chrystia Freeland finally they finally caved? They were small business, like you and I get a carbon rebate, right? And I hate that term. A rebate means you paid too much. It's not a refund is I give it back to you. A rebate means you paid too much. And so this week they finally announced that small businesses will also get a rebate, and their rebate won't be taxed. And I'm like, and people will, like people didn't even pay attention to the fact that the original rebate, I'm giving you your money back, but I'm going to tax, but it's going to be taxable income. And by the way, and a lot of people know this, right? Your carbon tax, when you get your $100 natural gas bill, and there's $10 of carbon tax on it, the carbon tax also has GST. There's GST charged on the carbon tax. So you're getting a tax on the tax. So the GST is charged on carbon tax. Yeah, the taxes for social engineering. That's I don't like that. I'm a libertarian. I think there should be incentives to. We don't need government incentives to do anything. If it's good, we'll do it, and if it's not, we won't do it. Like by definition, I don't know why the moment the government giving you money to buy an electric car, that just cheats the market. Like if electric cars are good, nobody needs to give an incentive for you or I to buy an electric car. And maybe a disincentive to. Yeah, no, I can't pick and choose, right? You're either in favor of it or not, and so I'm a free market guy. I mean, it is what it is.
I was going to throw another one in there. You ever heard of levies, like a recycling levy?
Yep.
That gets taxed too. And I'm like, wait a minute. Just because you're not calling it a tax doesn't mean it's not a tax. They're like, oh, it's a service. Well, you're forcing me to do it. It's a tax. And then you get tax on the levy. And it always drives me nuts.
I don't know if it's the case in BC, but it certainly is the case here in Alberta. Everybody, take your Walmart receipt next time you go do groceries and look at your receipt, right? You buy a case of Coke for $4.99. You're going to pay $1.20 for deposit on the Coke cans, and then you're going to pay, I don't know, 25 cents for an environmental fee. Like there's fees on fees on fees on fees. Like, yeah, tire levies. Levies, that's an example. Tire levies, right? You buy a brand new set of tires and you're paying an environmental levy on the tire for the disposal at the end of it. But they're all just taxes. I mean, I people use the word levy, subsidies, tax credits, whatever. They're all taxes in one way, shape, or another. We're like, and I stand by that. I mean, it's, if people want to go see on Twitter, you'd have to dig in, but go find that analysis I did on the taxes that people pay. And most people, they don't care about those things because they get a GST rebate or their carbon tax rebate, which makes them tax neutral. But there's that 15-20% of the population that's paying all the taxes.
The one that it was such a good slogan, they even slipped it past me, where they said, 8 out of 10 people get more back from the carbon tax than they put in. And it sounds really good. You're like, well, how do I deal with that? And then someone's like, you do realize what they're saying is 20% of the population is paying for the other 80.
Totally. Yeah, and actually, the parliamentary budget officer, I highly recommend people like go just Google parliamentary budget officer, and then go look under the tab called reports, and they put out reports like this all the time. And the parliamentary budget officer, he's the one who put out a report on the fiscal and financial impact of the carbon tax. And the parliamentary budget officer in paragraph 1 did say that financially, yes, 8 out of 10 Canadians get more than they paid. And by the way, it's a trinket, right? I mean, you paid $1,000 in carbon tax and you get $1,005. So you qualify. They can legally say you got more than you paid, right? You got $5 more. And so financially, the parliamentary budget officer agreed that 8 out of 10 get more back. But then he said, but fiscally, which is in the broader the whole economy, he was clear in his report that we all hurt. So you got $5 more. That's fine. You got a $5 check, but you paid, not only did you pay the carbon tax, you also paid $250 more for your ice cream and your groceries and the trip to the restaurant and your trip to Mexico. So fiscally, you're in the hole big time over that carbon tax. The PBO, he's poor guy. He's an independent guy. His name is Yves Giroux, and he's trying to do his job. When he gets called into committee, you can tell he's trying to be independent and he's trying to tell the story, but you can also tell that these independent bodies are under a lot of political pressure to twist the narrative. So it's up to you and I, right? This is why we do this. This is why I'm happy to come here, pushing against that narrative and trying to educate people. And it's not that hard to get educated. That's the other thing. That's why I said, go look at the parliamentary budget officer's report. Just read it for yourself. And if you have questions, ask somebody else what those questions mean. But most people can actually, if you're that inclined to learn about something, you'll figure out how to read the PBO report.
This is going in the direction I wanted it to go. So I had a guest this morning, and he said that the U.S. has something like 79,000 IRS agents. Canada has 66,000 CRA agents. So my question to you, it is, it's ridiculous. But my question to you is, for every $1 that they collect, like how much of that goes into actually collecting it?
I don't know, but it's a big number. I mean, it's and that's not unique to the CRA. It's like, I don't know. And those are some of these numbers. Some of these things are hard to find out. Like the more, the worse the data is, the worse the data shows something to be, the harder it is to find the data. You'll never find out the efficiency of the average CRA employee. God, I can't imagine. By definition, our tax revenue, or our tax collectors are 10 times less efficient than American ones.
Yeah, I know, because we got 1/10 roughly the population. Yeah.
And then they're all concentrated in Winnipeg, and Winnipeg keeps voting Liberal. Anyways, we won't go there.
The city. Well, they did this with the U.S. elections. They said there are no blue states, there's only blue cities. Like it's these urban centers that you have these government workers, and they support these policies.
Well, it's the same thing the same phenomena is manifesting itself here in Canada too. I mean, you guys had an election. The color differential between Victoria, Vancouver, and the rest of the province was dramatic. We have Edmonton. I always understood why we have Edmonton. I'm not sure why the oil capital of Canada, Calgary, is going orange, but it's urbanization. And let me put it this way: it's not just government employees working in the big cities, but big cities. I live in the country, right? And I encounter people all the time who come to Alberta and say, "Oh, we're conservatives." But then inevitably they talk, and as they're talking, I go, "Oh, there you go. You're talking big government, right? What did I say?" I'm like, "Well, you just complain about your garbage disposal. You want your garbage disposal twice a week instead of once a week. That's big government. You want your water, you want your skating rink, you want your Canada Post, you want like people have become addicted to governments, and governments have figured it out. Just keep giving them trinkets, bread and circuses, right? That's the I hope we're not at the decline of the Roman Empire point, but some days it feels like we're getting there, right? Like we're being fed these circus shows and given trinkets to be kept in line. It really is trinkets. Like, your carbon rebate, folks, like your carbon check. My God, like, yeah, okay, you got $250 for the quarter, but you paid $400. Like you're that's a funny one, actually. Have you seen all the advertising around the carbon rebate? Like they're literally having to explain to Canadians, like, every time the carbon checks come out, Twitter lights up with all the MPs saying, check your bank account, right? They're reminding people to go check at their bank accounts. And people are like, literally, even in my own family, I've had members go, yeah, I got this $400 that appeared in my bank account. I don't know what it's from. It's like, because it just says like CCT something. And so the government was struggling with that the government was frustrated that people didn't realize that the money they were getting was their carbon check rebate. In fact, the carbon check rebate, it started even worse than that. 3 years ago, when they first did the carbon rebate, you weren't getting a check. You were getting a credit at the end of the year on your taxes. So, if you owed $1,000, you'd have a credit. And then if you didn't owe anything, then you'd have a credit. Then you would get a check. And most people were going, well, I didn't get no carbon check because no, it's a credit on your taxes and you owed. So you're not going to get it. And that was ineffective for the Liberals. So that it drove them nuts that people weren't seeing the value of their carbon rebate. So then they made it an actual check. And even though people are getting an actual check because it's automatically deposited, with so many other checks, like it's crazy. People get a carbon rebate, a GST rebate, a Canada Child rebate, blah, blah, blah. And people are getting so much money from the government. The government's getting frustrated because the people don't know what check is what. And by the way, when the government, me personally, when the government says check your bank account, it means something totally different to me. It means like, now what? Have you frozen it? Like,
yeah, it's like they're taunting you. It's like, have you checked your account lately? Are you sure it's still there?
Yeah. And they keep sending me that letter, like you can sign up for automatic deposits. Bullshit. Actually, speaking of, here, I love doing this. I do it. I just do it. I get my paper check. What is this one? This is my $275 Canada carbon rebate. I keep it just as a reminder. So I'll go cash it in at some point, but it
reminds me the guy who built the railroad through the Rockies. He was so proud that he found a way through. He never cashed the check. He just framed it and put it on his wall.
Yeah.
Do the same thing. Create a collage.
Geez, yeah. And I'll eventually cash it, because if you don't cash it in, then you're really losing. But I'd rather just don't take it out of my pockets to start with. Don't humiliate, don't embarrass, or don't treat me like an idiot by telling me you're giving me, what is it, $275.50. Like you're insulting my intelligence with that check is what they're doing. So anyways, hey, can we read some of the questions, or have you read the questions, or what do you do? Like I see a few good questions, but
well, this guy mentioned they're not questions; they're just comments. Bread and circus, all the while blacksmith. forges ever stronger chains to be laid upon us. I wonder if he means BlackRock.
Could be. Yeah. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, they're mostly comments. I appreciate the comments. You got some you got a few good followers. That's cool.
Yeah, Wolf is a very smart guy. I've talked to him sometimes, and like 90% of what he said just goes over my head. But like I said, sixth grader over here.
Yeah.
What
No,
about a
this is
jubilee?
what's that?
What about a jubilee? What are your thoughts on that?
What do you mean a jubilee?
I think it's a biblical term. Every 12 years, 7 years, they got to forgive all debts.
Oh, yeah. No, that's been I I don't know what to think about that. I'd have to I mean in Canada, forgiving the debt is actually wouldn't be very problematic because it's not real. So it's not real. So if we forgive the problem is you could forgive the debt, but once we forgive the debt, then we'd have to create a new system afterwards, right? So if we forgave the debt, if we somehow or other accumulated gold reserves and did something like that and then forgave the debt and then started over, that's fine. But if we forgive the debt and keep with the exact same system, then we're screwed going forward because our whole monetary system will collapse. Nobody will want to transact because a piece of paper will be absolutely worthless. But yeah, without thinking about it too much, I think debt forgiveness is a bad idea. It's a bad idea. But
yeah, it's like a house of cards. Everyone's afraid.
Yeah.
Prairie says you have 1 day to cash that check.
How does he know that?
Do
they expire?
I think she probably went over once.
Yeah. No, is that true? Can a check? Does a check? No, a check doesn't have a date. I can't imagine a check has a date. Maybe it does. Thanks
From
for
my
reminding
experience,
me.
government or CRA checks are like money; they don't expire.
They don't expire. Yeah.
She's saying
Cool.
1 year, but Marty, another question for you. If the question comes up, I'll ask you. But how much of every dollar do you think? What percentage of every dollar do you think ends up in the government? I'm not just talking about taxes. I'm talking about hidden taxes, carbon tax, inflation, all these goddamn regulations that drive up the cost. Like, what's your sense?
Well, there's at least 50% of every dollar ends up back in the government. But then if you think about how many times it's recycled, it's a crazy amount of time, right? And then you realize $1 is not worth a lot. Like it ends up in I pay it as taxes. It's used to finance something. It comes back to me. Maybe not 50%, but yeah, 50, like a lot of money goes in and out through the government. Absolutely. Yeah. 50%. I'm going to go with 50%.
I can't. I'm kind of like, well, I am like you. I'm a libertarian, and I can't handle these taxes. I had a company. I shut it down because, the company's not doing well. We're not making a profit. I'm stressed out. And then bookkeeper comes in. She's like, by the way, it's been 2 weeks. You got to sign this check to the receiver general. I'm like, who is this receiver general? He's got the easiest job in the world. Just sits back and gets money from other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I took myself out of the economy a while ago. I'm doing okay. I took myself out. My financial planner thinks I'm a nut for doing it. I'm living really cheap, just trying to make sure I'm not cashing in investments or anything like that. Because even when you cash in investments, you have to pay taxes on them. And my guy's like, you're nuts. I'm like, nope. I just simply refuse to pay taxes to this government, in particular, to the federal government, because it's just getting wasted. And that's the other thing, right? Most of us agree. Like, I'm okay with a small government. I'm okay with a small government that helps out people that are less fortunate. I mean, fundamentally, I want a government that does some very basic functions, takes care of national defense, sets up laws so that you and I can trade and do commerce together, sets up the courts so they can arbitrate, maybe a little bit of policing. But beyond that, I want the government to be completely out of my way. But I understand that not everybody's that way, and some people want things from the government. Then keep it small, keep it reasonable, and which is what it was right up until, say, the 90s. And if you told me in the 1990s, Marty, some of your money's being used to not efficiently, the hospital's not running at peak efficiency, I would have gone, you know, I don't really give a shit. You know, my house is looking good. I got gas for the car and nobody's bothering me. But something flipped in the last 5-10 years, right? I mean, it's now the government
I wonder what.
yeah, you know, you know what I mean. Yeah, it's Trudeau, and it's some. Well, it starts before Trudeau. I mean, there's, you know, socialism got out of control, and now the government's working against me in particular, right? I'm a guy in the oil patch. I mean, I got a guy like Stephen Guilbeault who's against me, who wants to put me out of business. And then it was bad enough when the government's wasting my money, but they're not just wasting my money right now. Like they're stealing my money, and they're thumbing their noses at us, and they're not even hiding it, right? I mean, look at scandals that we've had in the last in the last 5 years, like Arrive scam and stuff like that. Like, hey, I mean, let me put it in the context this way. The scandal that broke the Chrétien liberals in the 1990s was the ad scam scandal, right? They had this bullshit corporation set up for advertising for sports, and it was used to funnel money. And in the end, the whole inquiry revealed that about $25 million had been misappropriated, misspent, and it collapsed the entire liberal government. Shit, $25 million? That's a week in this government, right? Like, I mean, it's billions and billions. Like, Freeland got on the news the other day. Like, we gave another $5 billion loan to Ukraine.
Didn't Guilbeault give $250 million to his own company?
He gave $250 million to his own company. I mean, he's at COP 29 right now, or 28, or whichever the one he is. He just gave, I don't know, $1.2 billion to some island nation somewhere because apparently the island is sinking. Like, and this is money we don't have. I talked about that today. You know, you and I were talking earlier. The budget is unbalanced. That's fine. We're going into deficit. We're paying a huge amount of interest on our debt. But in the budget, there's a line, like literally a miscellaneous transfer line for $86 billion. It's like that's just fun money for them to give away to whoever. $86 billion bucks. Like, yeah. So yeah, I'd prefer a smaller government, but no matter what, I want a government that respects my money, that the money that they're collecting from taxpayers. And these governments these days, they have no respect for our money. Like, no respect whatsoever. They're just wasting it.
I'm sort of on the same boat as you. 3 years ago now, I saw the writing on the wall, and I told everyone I know, I'm like, if you have land, you can't own land in BC. Like, if you own land, you're going to be public enemy number one. I sold my property. I bought a property in the US, like rent it out. I use the money to live here. I call it a money laundering operation. I take tyranny bucks and I launder them to the US for freedom dollars. My question is, do you think it'll, yeah. If anybody wants any tips, this isn't legal advice, but do you think they're going to impose an exit tax at some point?
I think there's already enough things that look like exit taxes that I don't even know that they need to put another one, right? I mean, they got our hooks into us. Anybody who's trying to leave the country is leaving behind. You'd have to be willing to leave behind, I don't know, your CPP and a few other things, I guess. Well, it's not a problem at this point, right? I mean, like if the odd person leaving, they're not they'll still tax you. I guess they don't need an exit tax because you continue to have to file taxes. They'll send you a bill some way or another. Yeah, good question. Never thought of that. An exit tax. I don't know.
Somebody mentioned it to me. They said, like, if it gets bad enough, if capital starts leaving the country, which I think it will, they might have to clamp down somehow.
Well, it's not leaving the country, but it's sure as hell not coming into the country. That's definitely noticeable, right? The investment money, people are not investing in Canada. I've witnessed it firsthand through the companies that I worked for. When we would go and try and raise money for projects here, nobody wanted to invest. Here locally, Danielle Smith talks about this all the time. Like, we have nice projects. Like companies will come and invest in oil and gas, but nobody wants to even come and build a power plant in Alberta. We need a couple of power plants. Nobody wants to build a power plant because it's a 2-3 year venture, and the risk of a government turning over during that period and money being stranded, people are afraid to invest in things that take a little bit longer. Somebody asked me that the other day with Trump being reelected. They said, "Do you think Keystone XL will go back on the shelf as a project?" And I'm like, it's still a valid project, but the companies won't do it because no matter what, it's 4 or 5 years, and in 4 or 5 years, Trump can get replaced by another guy, and the other guy is not friendly. So companies are risk adverse, and you know this, right? I mean, when you're a businessman, decisions are all about risk. Political risk, capital risk, project risk, and it's all about evaluating risk. And the political risk in Canada, it's weird, right? You'd think that Canada is one of the most stable countries in the world, and people don't want to invest here.
I'm reminded of a story, somewhat related. You could blame the company for this, but they were trying to build a tunnel here in BC. I don't know what it was for. It was for like a pipeline for electric or whatever. They brought somebody came in from Europe, and when they got here, they're like, "Oh, your tools are not allowed in Canada, so you can't work." So the company took them to court, and they got some massive settlement. I don't know, like $100 million. Well, that money, the government's not paying that. The taxpayer is paying that, but it's transparent. People don't make that connection. So that's like another way that the government is increasing our cost.
That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of what that would be. Well, if I'm going to make a joke about it, they basically came here with tools that didn't have bilingual instructions, right? So if your instructions are not in English and in French, I'm sending you back home, and then yeah. Oh, the rules for doing business in Canada are, again, like, I hope Trump is successful with Elon and Vivek and those guys, and then they make it efficient. I mean, that's a good thing. There's bad things about Trump being elected in the US, but there's also good things. I mean, the bad things is he's gonna do what's good for the US, right? And so what's good for the US is not necessarily good for Canada. I mean, if he becomes protection, if he puts in protective measures and he tries to kickstart their economy, and that could hurt us. But at the same time, he could also show us the way and lead and give us a model of how it can be done. So yeah, we'll see. And are you running for the PPC? Are you a candidate, or are you or you were?
No, I am. They haven't kicked me out yet.
Okay.
I had a chat with the CEO this morning. I thought they'd kick me out, but still, I'm here.
Why would they kick you out? No, I don't need to go into that, but I hopefully, some of the other parties, I think will try and pivot and adopt sort of a Trump American style politics, and I'm happy with that. I mean, everybody made it sound like, the liberals, they kept saying like American style politics. Well, we just saw American style politics, and you might want to pay attention to American style politics, folks, because we're about to get hit by the same thing. I think Canadians are fed up kind of the same way that Americans were fed up.
I thought the US, the way that they conducted themselves from 2020 to 2024, it was really remarkable how quickly they flooded every single precinct, how they got rid of the Republican Party GOP president, Ronna McDaniels, replaced her with Lara Trump, and how quickly they pivoted from mainstream media to alternative media. Like, they all sprung up, they made politics cool, and we really need to do that in Canada as well.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Well, you're doing your part. I'm doing my part. Clyde's doing his part. So yeah. No, this is the new media, folks. Like, I'm glad. What's your audience like? After today, what you'll get? What? Do you reach 1,000 people on a little show like this, or?
Not live. Like, I'm sure Clyde's got a bigger following. He's got a more established show, so he might get 1,000. I'll get like between 100 and 250, and then I'll get a lot of views later on.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm hoping to grow that. Not so much to become a celebrity, but to get the message out.
That's what, yeah, I mean, that's why I'm doing it, and I'm happy to help everybody. But I'm happy, like I said, I'll reshare this after it's done. It's the not everybody wants to talk about GDP. And so when you reached out and said, "Hey, do you want to talk about GDP?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about GDP." GDP. Actually, it was a good chat today. I hope we reached a few people. I'm sure we did. I mean, your viewers are probably all on board, so we're not going to sway them. But hopefully we give them a little bit of ammunition so that somebody who's already on our team, when they come across somebody who's on the fence, then they can take a piece from this. I mean, that's the best we can hope for. Like, yeah, our governments the debt is out of control. Yeah.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, the whole purpose of what we're doing is to equip the public with arguments that they can use and to sway people over.
Yeah. And I love Twitter for that, because you can, that's where I'm mostly on these days. I'm not on many other platforms, and Twitter, you get instant feedback. Like, I'll talk about a topic, and then you can see whether it resonates or not, or whether you've made a mistake. And so if you've made a mistake, you can adjust, and you get instant feedback, and it's also like, I'll ask genuine questions on there, and then I get some crazy feedback. Like the other day, I was confused about mortgages. I had a question about mortgages, and I just put it out there, and then boom, like I was getting real feedback, and people sending me DMs who work in the mortgages. Like, the question I asked was like around, if you got a mortgage at 5%, and now at what point would you cancel your mortgage or renege on your mortgage or try to weasel out of your mortgage? Like, is there a rule of thumb? And then I got some great feedback. Apparently, yeah, if you're locked in at 5 and you're at 3, don't weasel out of your mortgage. Don't try and cancel it, but go to your bank and renegotiate in good faith. Because if you're a good customer, they won't want to lose you anyway. So they'll blend your mortgage and renegotiate you to whatever, 3.5 or something like that. But anyways, it was just an example. So just like you reached out, people reach out all the time on Twitter, and I tell people, feel free. Like, my DMs are open. Tag me. And let's have some discussions, man. Let's talk. That's how we it's one of the cornerstones of our democracy, right? I talk about this often. Like, we live in a democracy, which is a scary thing, because democracy is the will of the many. Like, it is what it is, right? And so if you're a minority in a democracy, it can be scary. And we live in a democracy. And the cornerstone of that democracy is that vote. We each have a vote, but that vote, to me, needs to be educated. That's the key thing, right? When you're about to vote, you really should be aware of some of the issues before you vote. And I find that people aren't, because one of the places we used to get educated was through the medias. And I think the mainstream media, have failed miserably. I mean, they're not educating us. They're spreading propaganda. So you and I here have a very key role to play on Twitter, is to help educate people, because that vote is powerful and dangerous at the same time. And I want people to be as educated as possible before they exercise their vote.
No, you're right. And there's an appetite for long format like this, as opposed to like little sound bites. So you're doing good work.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, Marty.
Yeah.
I guess you can do a plug for yourself, but I'm pretty sure everyone knows you. But where can they follow you?
Marty Up North on Twitter. It's Marty Up North, unacceptable fact checker, and it's actually Marty Up North _2. And the reason there's a 2 there is I started out as Marty Up North, and then the first account got blasted, so I was Marty Up North _1. That got blasted. Now I'm _2. The old accounts are all back. When Elon bought Twitter, he reinstated some of the accounts. I got blasted for busting the COVID narrative, and I wasn't lying. I was telling the truth. I was sharing government tables and information, but Twitter didn't like that, the original owners. But now I'm back. But the one I engage with is Marty Up North _2.
And when is your weekly podcast with Clyde Do Something?
It's Wednesday night, but we record, so Clyde releases it on Thursday morning. It's under his headline. It's under Clyde Do Something. I don't have a podcast. I'm a Twitter guy mostly, but I come on a lot of people's podcasts. Love doing it.
All right, Marty, it was a blast having you on. I had a really good time. I never thought I'd get to an age where I would enjoy talking GDP with another guy, but thanks for coming on.
You're welcome, man. Have a good day. Cheers.
You too.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.